The dream always started the same way. A hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, stretching into a hazy infinity that smelled faintly of dust and disuse. Each door was a twin to the last, unmarked, unyielding. I'd walk, my footsteps muffled by a threadbare carpet, the silence pressing in around me until it hummed against my eardrums. No windows, no exits, just the endless procession of doors, each promising nothing more than the last. I never dared to knock. I never dared to try a handle. The sameness was the terror, a mirror of the days I'd been living since everything changed. The air here carried a different kind of staleness, a mix of old coffee and forgotten takeout, a scent that had become as much a part of me as my own skin. Another Tuesday. Another sunrise bleeding grayly through the grime on the window pane. My routine, honed by months of quiet despair, unfolded like a well-rehearsed play with a single, unenthusiastic actor. Coffee, a stale piece of toast, the drone of the morning news I didn't listen to just for the human voices. The quiet was louder than any noise. My name is Seth. I used to have a life. A job, friends, a future that felt, if not bright, then at least discernible. Now the future was a blurred expanse like the far end of that dream corridor. I existed. That was the most I could say. I moved through my days with a detached weariness, a ghost haunting my own life. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, a stark white rectangle amidst the usual bills and junk mail. It bore a crest I didn't recognize, a heavy wax seal that seemed archaic in its formality. My fingers, surprisingly steady, tore the envelope open. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, and smelled faintly of old parchment. It was from a legal firm I'd never heard of, based in a town I couldn't place on a map. My eyes scanned the elegant script. It is with a mixture of solemn duty and unexpected tidings that we inform you of the passing of your distant relative, Eleonora Vance. The name meant nothing to me, Eleonora Vance. I tried to conjure a face, a memory, anything. Nothing. My family tree, as far as I knew it, was a stunted thing, pruned by time and tragedy. The letter continued, each word a slow drip of the surreal, and as her last surviving kin, you have been named the sole beneficiary of her estate. My breath hitched. Estate. My apartment barely qualified as an estate. What could this possibly mean? A distant relative I'd never known bequeathing something to me, a man adrift in his own life. It felt like a cosmic joke or a misplaced delivery. Then came the details, stark and precise. This includes the property known as Blackwood Manor, located in the remote region of Atheria. Blackwood Manor, Atheria. I pictured dense, ancient forests far from any paved road, far from any human warmth. The letter mentioned the property had been in the Vance family for generations, largely untouched for decades, its true value now lying not in its upkeep but in its history. A profound unease settled over me. It wasn't the thrill of sudden wealth or even the comfort of a new home. It was the sheer, unadulterated strangeness of it all. Why me? Why now? Was this some elaborate scam? I reread the letter, searching for a catch, a hidden fee, a clause that would reveal the trick. There was none. Only an invitation to contact the firm to arrange for the transfer of ownership, to step into a legacy I never knew existed. My first impulse was to dismiss it, to toss the letter into the recycling bin and return to the comforting, if suffocating, monotony of my despair. The unknown felt too vast, too demanding. But then, a different thought pricked through the fog of my apathy. What did I have to lose? My current life was an empty vessel echoing with absence. The hotel corridor dream, the one with the identical doors forever, flashed in my mind. Perhaps this was a door finally that wasn't identical. Perhaps it led somewhere, anywhere. A remote, decaying ancestral home, untouched for decades. Blackwood Manor. It sounded like something out of a story, a place where things might happen, good or bad, but at least something. I was tired of nothing. I was tired of the endless, identical doors. I called the legal firm. The solicitor, a man with a voice like polished mahogany, confirmed everything in the letter, his tone impeccably formal. He spoke of papers to sign, of keys to collect, of a long drive through increasingly isolated terrain. He didn't ask why I hadn't known of Eleonora Vance, or why a man like me, with nothing but a lingering grief, would accept such a burden. He simply processed the transaction, a cog in the machinery of inheritance. In the days that followed, I packed what little I truly owned: a few worn books, some clothes, the framed photograph of those I'd lost. It wasn't much, but it was all I had left of my old life. I was exchanging one form of isolation for another, an empty apartment for a forgotten manor, a familiar quiet for an unknown one. As I locked the door to my old life for the last time, the weight of the key in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just a key to a new place. It felt like a key to a new existence, one I hadn't asked for, one I knew nothing about. What secrets did Blackwood Manor hold within its decaying walls, and what would it demand of me in return for its inheritance? The dream, the one that always started in that hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, dissolved with the first insistent chirp of my phone alarm. For a moment, the heavy silence of the rented room felt more oppressive than the hazy infinity of the dream. I could almost still smell the dust and disuse. My throat felt dry. I pushed myself up, the cheap mattress groaning in protest, and ran a hand over my stubbled jaw. Another day, another step. I packed the last of my meager belongings into the back of the small, rented sedan. The city was already stirring, a distant hum of traffic that felt utterly alien to where I was headed, the house. My ancestral home, the solicitor had called it, as if it were a grand title rather than a dusty inheritance. A fresh start, I told myself, a new beginning away from everything. The words felt hollow even in my own head, but I clung to them. Determination was a thin, brittle shield, but it was all I had left. The drive was long, stretching out beneath a sky that started pale blue and gradually deepened to a bruised purple by late afternoon. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track barely wide enough for the car. Trees pressed in from both sides, ancient pines and gnarled oaks, their branches interlocked overhead, creating a tunnel of perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of earth and decaying leaves. My shoulders tightened, a knot forming between my shoulder blades. The GPS, which had been so confidently guiding me, now showed only a blank green expanse, a single pin marking my destination, lost in the wilderness. Then through a break in the trees I saw it, a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. The roofline sagged in places, a testament to neglect. The paint, once a proud white, had peeled and blistered into a mottled gray, revealing the raw wood beneath. It was larger than I'd imagined, sprawling and asymmetrical, with turrets and wings that seemed to have been added haphazardly over centuries. A sense of immense age, of heavy slumber hung about it. A shiver traced its way down my spine, but I attributed it to the plummeting temperature. I parked the car in front of what must have once been a manicured lawn, now a tangled wilderness of weeds and overgrown shrubs. A gravel path, choked with moss, led to a massive oak front door. The brass knocker, shaped like a gargoyle's head, was tarnished almost black. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold metal. This was it, no turning back. With a deep breath, I pushed the door inward. It moved with a slow, agonizing groan, scraping against the floorboards. The sound echoed into the cavernous space beyond. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood or forgotten iron. Even with the door ajar, the interior swallowed the last vestiges of daylight. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. I stood in a grand, albeit decaying, foyer. Cobwebs draped from the high ceilings like tattered funeral shrouds. Dust motes danced in the weak light, swirling in currents I couldn't feel. I walked deeper, my breath catching in my chest. To my left, a drawing room, or what used to be one. Furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like ghostly figures, their forms obscured and menacing. I pulled my jacket tighter. I tried to be methodical, logical. This was an old house. It would have drafts. It would have strange smells. It would make noises. Above it, a portrait hung askew, covered by a thick layer of grime. I couldn't make out the face, but the eyes, even obscured, seemed to follow me. I shook my head. Fatigue. Imagination. I moved into what appeared to be a dining room, a long, heavy table shrouded in white. As I passed, a faint scratching sound came from behind one of the sheets. My head snapped around. My heart gave a lurch. Just the house settling, I told myself, trying to calm the sudden tremor in my hands. Old wood expands and contracts. I continued my exploration, room after room, each one echoing the same theme of vastness and decay. A library with shelves full of moldering books, their spines cracked and faded. The sheer scale of the place was daunting. How had one family lived here? How had they left it to rot? I found myself in a long, narrow corridor lined with more closed doors. This felt familiar, a prickle of unease. Not exactly the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, but the feeling of endless, silent passages. My flashlight beam danced over each door, revealing peeling paint and tarnished brass knobs. One of the doors, halfway down the hall, seemed slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it, had I? My breath hitched. It sounded like a sigh, or perhaps the wind. My hand reached out, trembling slightly, towards the doorknob. What was behind it, and why did I feel an overwhelming certainty that it had not been ajar moments before? I could almost still smell the dust, thick and ancient, clinging to the air of the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, and something else, something metallic and cold. That wasn't quite a scent, but an impression. The dream had been a familiar torment, a silent expanse of sameness that pressed in on me, always just beyond my grasp. But then the phone alarm chirped a third, insistent time, dragging me back to the too bright reality of the rented room. I blinked, the image of those identical doors dissolving into the patterned wallpaper, and the heavy silence of the room felt more oppressive than the hazy infinity of the dream. I moved into the house a week later. The journey had been long, the roads dwindling from paved highways to gravel tracks, then finally to a narrow, overgrown lane that ended abruptly at a wrought iron gate rusted shut. The house stood beyond it, a sentinel of weathered stone and peeling paint, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over acres of wild, untamed land. It was larger than I'd imagined, and far more dilapidated. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the decay. I dragged my meager belongings inside, each step echoing in the cavernous entrance hall. My determination, a fragile shield against the enormity of my loss and the daunting task ahead, wavered only slightly. This was it, my new beginning. The first oddity came that evening as I was trying to find the fuse box. The house was a labyrinth of dark corridors and unfamiliar rooms, each one colder than the last. As I rounded a corner near what I suspected was the old kitchen, a movement snagged the edge of my vision. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. I stood there, phone beam fixed on the empty doorway, listening. Nothing. Only the creak of the old house settling, the distant groan of timbers. My heart thumped a nervous rhythm against my ribs. Just my eyes playing tricks. I muttered aloud, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast quiet. Long drive, tired. I rationalized it, pushing the image of the swift, unnatural movement from my mind. It was an old house, after all. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the work of making the house habitable. I swept away generations of dust, uncovered furniture draped in sheets like ghosts, and wrestled with stubborn windows that had forgotten how to open. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a way to anchor myself in the present, away from the endless loop of grief that had plagued me since everything. I was trying to read by the dim light of a single bulb I'd managed to string up in the living room, the only room that felt remotely livable. The silence was absolute, pressing in on me, making the rustle of the book pages sound like thunder. Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like dry leaves skittering across a distant floor, or perhaps something else. A voice. Indistinct, breathy, just outside the range of comprehension. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a barely there murmur that brushed against the edges of my hearing. The hairs on my arms prickled. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. Only the familiar creaks and groans of the house. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. My hands felt cold. Wind, I told myself, the word a desperate whisper in the silence. Just the wind, getting in through a loose pane. I tried to believe it, tried to dismiss the disquiet that had begun to coil in my stomach. The house was old, yes, drafty, it made sense. But then the next morning I found my grandfather's old pocket watch. I had placed it carefully on the nightstand beside my makeshift bed, a small comfort, a tangible link to a past that felt less haunted. I was certain of its position. I'd even adjusted the chain so it wouldn't scratch the wood. Yet when I went to retrieve it, the nightstand was empty. My eyes scanned the room, a creeping unease tightening its grip. I found it moments later on the mantelpiece in the living room, tucked behind a dusty ceramic vase that had been there since I arrived. I stared at it, a knot forming in my chest. I hadn't touched the mantelpiece since I'd cleaned the living room days ago, and I certainly hadn't moved the watch. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavy, unnervingly so. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't dust motes. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Had I sleepwalked? No, I never had. Had I put it there myself and forgotten? But I had been so deliberate, so careful with it. The house, once a symbol of a fresh start, now felt like a cage. I looked around the silent, cavernous room, the watch heavy in my palm. Was I truly alone here? The stale taste of old air still clung to my tongue as I blinked awake. The hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever had faded, but the phantom chill of that endless, metallic sameness lingered. My sheets felt damp, not with sweat, but with an unfamiliar coldness that seemed to have seeped into the very fabric of the room. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and scanned the unfamiliar bedroom. A shiver traced its way down my spine, more profound than the memory of the dream. This was localized. My breath plumed faintly in the air directly in front of me, a small cloud of vapor escaping my lips. I reached out a hand, palm open, and felt it immediately, a distinct pocket of frigid air perhaps 3 feet from the bed. It was like plunging my hand into icy water but without the wetness. The hairs on my arm stood on end, prickling. I pulled my hand back sharply, my heart giving a sudden hard thump against my ribs. This was different. It felt personal, like something had settled there just out of sight, watching me wake. I swung my legs out of bed, careful not to step into that invisible patch of frost. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a familiar sound, but then another sound followed, faint but distinct. A rustle. This was a paper-thin sound, like dried leaves skittering across a floor or a page turning. It came from the hallway just beyond my closed door. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Only the low hum of the old house, a symphony of creaks and groans that had become my constant companion. I told myself it was the house, just the house, an old place settling. It remained, a silent, icy sentinel in the middle of my room. The air in the rest of the room felt merely cool by comparison. I stood, pulling on a thick sweater, my movements deliberate, trying to project an air of calm I didn't feel. Stepping into the hallway, the air felt normal, if a little dusty. The rustling sound didn't repeat. Nothing seemed disturbed. No doors ajar that I remembered closing. No objects out of place. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted, a prickle on the back of my neck that made me want to turn around quickly to catch whatever was there. I didn't. I forced myself to walk slowly, to examine the peeling wallpaper, the cracked plaster. This place was trying to play tricks on me, I decided. My grief, my isolation, they were fertile ground for a nervous mind. I could still feel its imprint on my hand, a lingering ache. The warmth seemed to drain from me almost immediately. I found myself drawn to the small, dusty study on the ground floor, a room I hadn't properly explored. It was lined with shelves full of ancient, leather-bound books, many of them crumbling at the touch. A heavy oak desk sat in the center, its surface scarred and ink-stained. This felt like a place where history was kept, where secrets might be filed away. I powered up my laptop, the screen a jarring beacon of modernity in the dim, antique room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What did I even search for? Haunted house, street name, town name. It felt ridiculous. I started with something simpler, the house's address, then the name of the family from whom I'd inherited it. The search results were sparse. A few old property listings, mentions in local historical society archives. Nothing alarming. Nothing supernatural. Then I found an old digitized newspaper clipping, dated 1937. The headline was innocuous: "Local family vacates ancestral home." The article spoke of unforeseen circumstances and a sudden change of plans. It was vague, almost deliberately so. The family, the article noted, had left most of their possessions behind, relocating abruptly to another state. No reason given, just gone. I clicked on related articles, digging deeper. Another one from 1902 mentioned the house again. Tragedy strikes family name residence. A young woman, the daughter of the then owner, had succumbed to a sudden illness. The wording was stiff, formal, but the underlying implication was clear. Something was wrong. Her death was unexpected, unexplained. I leaned back in the creaking desk chair, a new unease settling over me. The house wasn't just old. It had a history of abrupt departures and unexplained misfortunes. My eyes drifted to the bookshelves, crammed with forgotten knowledge. Maybe the internet wasn't the only source. Maybe the answers were here within these walls. I began to pull books from the shelves, gently, carefully. Many were dry legal tomes or obscure philosophical texts, but then I found a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages brittle with age. No title, no author listed, just a faint, almost invisible symbol pressed into the leather, a twisted, stylized knot. It felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. I opened it. The ink was faded, the handwriting spidery and difficult to decipher, but it was a journal, a personal record. The first entry was dated 1889. I skipped ahead, looking for anything that might connect to the house's strange history, to the vague allusions in the newspaper clippings. And then I saw it, always in the periphery. It watches from the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever, even there in my sleep. It wants more than just my solitude, it wants my everything. My breath hitched. The hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. The dream, my dream. How could this unknown, long-dead person have written about it? This wasn't just a house with a history of bad luck. This was something else, something that had been here for a very long time, twisting minds, feeding on despair. What exactly had I stumbled into? The cold dread that had spread through me, numbing my limbs, was a physical thing. It wasn't just the localized chill of the bedroom. It was the certainty that this old journal, with its faded ink and brittle pages, held a piece of my mind. My dream. How? How could someone I'd never known, someone long dead, have described the exact landscape of my most recurring nightmare? My hands, though still trembling, gripped the journal tighter. This wasn't just a house with a history. It was a house with a memory, a malevolent echo that resonated with my deepest fears. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, not with the weight of dust, but with something unseen, something listening. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being observed, even though I was alone. I couldn't just leave it. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. My sense of aimlessness, which had drawn me to this decaying place, was abruptly replaced by a sharp, almost desperate focus. I needed answers. This house, this inheritance, was far more than a fresh start. It was a trap, or perhaps a warning. I spent the rest of the day in a frantic, almost obsessive search. I tore through the dusty library, pulling books from their shelves, not for their content, but for what might be hidden behind them. My fingers grew grimy with decades of settled dust, and the scent of mildewed paper and ancient wood filled my nostrils, a cloying perfume that seemed to stick to my skin. Hours blurred. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, but I barely noticed. My stomach growled, ignored. My throat was dry, but I pushed on. I was driven by a new, consuming need, a gnawing curiosity that felt less like an intellectual pursuit and more like a fever. Finally, in a forgotten corner of the attic, under a pile of moth-eaten tapestries and broken furniture, I found it, a heavy, iron-bound chest. It wasn't locked, merely latched as if waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against my determination. I threw open the lid. Inside lay a jumble of documents, yellowed letters tied with faded ribbons, more journals, and even a small, leather-bound diary. Each item seemed to hum with a silent, unsettling energy. I pulled out a stack of letters first, their cursive script sprawling and difficult to decipher. They spoke of the house, of the increasing gloom that settled upon its occupants. She claims the very walls breathe. We have tried to reason with her, but she only laughs, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. She says they are calling her home. The letter ended abruptly, with no explanation of what became of the matriarch. I moved on to a journal smaller than the first, dated 1923. The entry started normally, mundane observations about the weather, garden plans, then a subtle shift. The quiet is too deep today, it presses against my ears. I feel watched even when alone. Later, the dreams have begun again. Always the same winding path leading to a door that is never quite reachable. The final entry, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, simply read, "It wants more than sorrow, it wants me. I cannot fight it, I see its eyes." The journal stopped there. No further entries, no explanation. My throat tightened. The air in the attic, already stale, felt suddenly thin, as if something else was breathing it. I found several newspaper clippings, brittle with age. One from 1957 reported the mysterious disappearance of a resident, a solitary artist, from the very house I now inhabited. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, the article stated. The local authorities are baffled, suspecting foul play. The home was locked from the inside. Another clipping, a decade later, detailed a tragic accident. A young woman, a distant relative, found at the base of the grand staircase, her neck broken. The article mentioned her recent melancholia and hinted at suicide, but the tone of the report felt dismissive, too quick to conclude. Madness, disappearances, tragic ends, all linked to this house, all echoing a pattern. My own loneliness, my grief, my aimlessness, they were not just personal burdens, but bait. The first journal, my dream. It was a sign, a premonition, or worse, a direct invitation. I closed the chest with a shudder, the clang echoing too loudly in the quiet attic. The sun had long since vanished, plunging the house into a profound, suffocating gloom. I stumbled down the stairs, the creaks of the old wood sounding like groans. Sleep did not come easily. When I finally drifted off, it was not into peaceful oblivion. I was in a vast, empty space. The air was thick, heavy, like breathing mud. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the space stretching endlessly around me. Then a sound, a faint, repetitive scraping like bone on stone, and with it a presence. Not a shape, not a form I could distinguish, but an immense, ancient hunger. It was everywhere. It was in the air I breathed, the ground beneath my non-existent feet. It knew my name, my sorrow, my fear. A voice not heard with my ears but felt in my very core echoed through the vastness. Lost, alone, my heart throbbed, a frantic, irregular rhythm. Was it just a dream, or had the house, or whatever resided within its decaying walls, already begun to claim me? I jolted awake, gasping, my body slick with cold sweat. The room was dark, silent, but the echo of that presence lingered, a foul taste in my mouth, a chill deep in my bones. Or had the house, or whatever resided within its decaying walls, finally found a way inside me? The air felt heavy like wet wool pressing down on my chest. Sleep was a distant, unreachable shore. My mind, sharp with fear, told me I couldn't stay in that room, not another moment. I needed to get out, even if only for a few hours. Pulling myself from the bed, my muscles protested, stiff and aching. I dressed quickly, grabbing my keys and wallet, my movements stiff, almost robotic. The drive, I reasoned, would clear my head. A coffee from a gas station, a brief escape from the house's suffocating embrace. I remember walking down the grand staircase, its banister slick and dusty under my palm. I remember the click of the heavy front door locking behind me. The cool night air hit my face, a momentary balm. The car, my old sedan, sat waiting, its paint dulled by the night. I started the engine, the familiar rumble a comforting sound. The headlights cut through the inky blackness, illuminating the winding gravel path. I drove faster than I should have, the tires spitting loose stones, or so I thought. The next thing I remember, a sharp jolt, a sudden stop. My head throbbed. I was standing, not in front of my car, but in a narrow, dimly lit space. The air here was stale, metallic, and carried a faint, cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. Fluorescent lights, buzzing with a high-pitched whine, cast a sickly yellow glow on the walls. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. Where was I? The question clawed at my throat. I was in a hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. The words solidified in my mind, stark and terrifying. A long, unbroken line of identical, polished wooden doors stretched into the distance, both ahead of me and behind. Each door had a gleaming brass handle and a small, square number plaque. The numbers were sequential, rising and falling, yet they never seemed to truly progress. I walked forward, counting 601, 602, 603. I turned back, 600, 599, 598. It was impossible. The corridor should have ended, should have turned, should have led somewhere, but it didn't. It just kept going, an endless, repeating loop. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. I tried a door, any door, it didn't budge, locked. I tried 608, 609, all locked. My breath hitched. Was I truly here? Had I crashed the car? Was this some kind of dream state after an accident? The logical part of my brain screamed for an explanation. Then I saw it, my reflection in the polished surface of door 612. My face was pale, drawn, but behind me in the distorted sheen was not the endless corridor. I spun around, my blood turning to ice. The corridor was still there, stretching into infinity. No portraits, no house. Just the identical doors. I turned back to the reflection. It was gone. Only my own terrified face stared back at me. My hands felt clammy. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. A low hum started, vibrating through the floor up into my feet. It wasn't the fluorescent lights anymore. It was deeper, resonating in my teeth. My name, Seth. It wasn't my own voice. I pressed my hands against my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. It didn't help. The voices were inside my head, echoing the same insecurities I tried to bury. My loneliness, my grief for those I'd lost, my fear of being forgotten, of being nothing. The entity was here. It had followed me. No, it hadn't followed me. It had brought me here. This endless corridor, this cruel mockery of an escape was its creation. I opened my eyes, desperate for anything to ground me. The doors shimmered. The numbers on the plaques began to shift, blurring, reforming. Door 623 now read Mother. Door 624, Father. Door 625, Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. These weren't numbers. These were names. The names of those I'd lost. The names that haunted my waking thoughts and my nightmares. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a choked cry. I stumbled backward, bumping into the opposite wall, the rough texture of the wallpaper scraping against my coat. My eyes darted from door to door, each bearing a name, a painful memory, a ghost of my past. Each one seemed to pulse faintly, a low, internal light flickering behind the wood. My legs felt like jelly. The air grew heavier still, suffocating. The sweet, metallic smell was overwhelming now, thick in my throat. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. This was a prison built from my own sorrow. How did I get here? And more terrifyingly, how would I ever leave? I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the rough wool blanket catching on my skin. The air felt heavy still, yet somehow different. I stood, my bare feet sinking slightly into the worn carpet. The floorboards, usually groaning with every shift of weight, remained silent. A strange calm settled over me, an insidious quiet that smoothed the edges of my panic. The lingering fear from the dream began to dissolve, replaced by a soft, almost comforting hum that vibrated through the very fabric of the house. It was like a low, resonant chord struck deep within the foundations, a sound I felt more than heard. It wasn't menacing, not exactly. It was inviting. I walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet drape. Moonlight, pale and diffuse, spilled across the overgrown garden. The gnarled trees, usually menacing silhouettes, now seemed to stand guard, ancient protectors rather than twisted specters. For the first time since I arrived, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a home, my home, and I wasn't alone. The thought, at first, sparked a familiar pang of loneliness, a reminder of what I had lost. But then, a subtle shift. The loneliness didn't deepen. Instead, it was met, absorbed by that pervasive hum, that gentle warmth. It wasn't words, not really, but an impression. You don't have to be alone, Seth. My determination, usually a stubborn knot in my stomach, began to unravel. What if this wasn't malevolence? What if this presence, this ancient thing, was simply misunderstood? It offered solace, a balm for the raw wounds of my grief. It promised an end to the gnawing emptiness. The idea was seductive, a siren song echoing in the quiet chambers of my mind. To never feel that crushing weight again, to simply exist, enveloped in this strange, profound peace. This comfort felt too easy, too complete. It wasn't earned, it was given. And what was the cost of such a gift? I had to know. I had to fight this insidious peace. I needed to call someone, anyone. A colleague from my old job, the estate lawyer, even a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. Just a voice, a connection to the world outside these walls. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over the name of a former colleague. My finger pressed down, the phone raised to my ear. Nothing. No dial tone, no ringing. I tried again. Same result. The signal bars on the screen showed full strength, yet the call wouldn't connect. I tried texting. The messages hung, sending. Perpetually, never delivering. Frustration flared, hot and sharp, cutting through the deceptive calm. This wasn't just a poor signal. This was deliberate. My blood began to prickle, the false warmth of the house now feeling suffocating. I needed to leave. I snatched my keys, my wallet, anything I could grab, and stumbled down the grand staircase. Each step was an effort, as if the very air had turned to thick syrup. The front door, a massive slab of oak, loomed before me. It turned. I pulled. The door opened with a slow, grinding groan, revealing not the moonlit drive or the overgrown garden, but something else entirely. My breath hitched. I stood in a long, narrow space, illuminated by a faint, sterile light that emanated from recessed fixtures in the low ceiling. The walls were covered in a faded, floral wallpaper, identical patterns repeating into the distance. There was no end, no beginning. I was standing in a hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. I spun around, desperate to see the familiar hallway of the house, the grand staircase, anything that made sense. But behind me was another identical door, indistinguishable from all the others. The front door of my house was gone. I tried the door beside me, then the next, locked, all of them. It was a vacuum pressing in on me, stealing my air. I started to walk, my footsteps echoing unnaturally on the thin carpet. I walked faster, then faster still, my heart racing. Each door was the same, each number a meaningless cipher. There was no window, no exit sign, no elevator, just this endless, identical stretch. My mind reeled. This was the entity. This was its solution to my loneliness, complete, absolute isolation, a prison of endless repetition. It hadn't just isolated me from the outside world. It had warped the very fabric of my reality, trapping me in a hallucination or something far worse. How long had I been walking? Minutes? Hours? The sterile light never changed. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I pounded on a door, then another, my fists stinging. No response. The corridor swallowed the sound, leaving only the frantic thud of my own pulse. I leaned against a door, sliding down to the carpet, gasping for breath. The house, or whatever malevolent force now held me, wanted me to surrender. It wanted me to accept this endless, identical solitude as my new reality, a permanent escape from grief, from choice, from life itself. But what would happen if I did? What did it truly mean to give myself over to the house, to accept its insidious comfort in this endless, impossible place? The lure of the entity, the soft whisper of understanding in my grief-racked mind, had been a dangerous seduction. It promised an end to the gnawing emptiness, a balm for the raw wounds. I had almost succumbed, almost convinced myself that this ancient presence was not malevolent but simply misunderstood. I had spent hours in the decaying parlor, staring at the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight, trying to rationalize the impossible. My determination, a stubborn knot in my stomach, had begun to unravel thread by thread. But then the house had shifted. It wasn't a creak of old wood or a sudden draft. It was a profound, fundamental alteration, a sickening lurch that settled deep in my bones. I had been standing in the main hall, tracing the faint pattern of the peeling wallpaper, trying to find some anchor in the familiar decay. One moment, the grand staircase loomed before me, its banister slick with dust. The next, the air grew thick and still, tasting of ozone and something vaguely metallic. The light, which had been a dull afternoon gray, sharpened into an artificial, clinical glare, pulsing from unseen fixtures above. My breath hitched. The wallpaper, that familiar floral design, had smoothed, stretched, and reformed into a uniform beige texture, unmarked and sterile. The grand staircase was gone. In its place, stretching endlessly in either direction, was a long, narrow passage. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My mind scrambled, trying to reassert logic, to find the seam where reality had torn. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The corridor remained. It was impossible. My ancestral home, the place I had sought refuge, had warped around me. Each door was a mirror image of the last. Polished brass numbers 601, 602, 603, then 601 again on dark, unblemished wood. No handles, just smooth, flush surfaces. There was no sound beyond my own ragged breathing. No distant traffic, no wind rattling unseen windows, no groan of old timbers. I took a tentative step forward, then another. My sneakers felt strangely heavy, dragging against the plush carpet. The air was cool but not refreshing. It felt recycled, dead. This wasn't a dream. My fingers, when I clenched them, were real. My stomach churned with a sickening blend of fear and disbelief. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "Hello." The word was swallowed instantly by the vast, unfeeling expanse. It felt utterly insignificant. I began to walk faster now, a desperate urgency propelling me. I had to find an end, a window, anything that wasn't another identical door. I passed 604, 605, 606. My eyes darted to the numbers, searching for a pattern, a break in the monotony. There was none. Each door looked exactly the same. They felt solid, unyielding, as if they were merely decorative facades on a continuous wall. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor. It was so subtle I almost dismissed it as my own nerves. Then it happened again, a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of my feet. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and deep, emanating from the very structure of the corridor. My breath hitched again. My palms were slick with sweat. I forced myself to reach out, to touch one of the doors. The wood was smooth, cool, almost unnervingly perfect. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything from within. Nothing. I kept walking. My pace quickened to a jog, then a full sprint. I needed to escape this looping nightmare. The numbers blurred past 607, 608, 609. Then, incomprehensibly, 601 again. My legs burned. My lungs ached. I stopped, gasping, leaning against the wall, my forehead pressed to the cool, sterile surface. I had run in a circle, or worse, the corridor had simply extended itself, mocking my efforts. This wasn't just a trick of the light or a hallucination born of grief. This was real. The house was gone. My safe, albeit decaying, haven had been replaced by this endless, sterile prison. The entity wasn't just influencing my mind. It was warping reality itself around me. It had cornered me. My mental defenses, which had been so close to crumbling before, shattered completely. There was no misunderstanding here. This was a deliberate act, a conscious twisting. I slid down the wall, sinking to the carpet, my knees weak. My head fell into my hands. The low thrumming returned, stronger this time, a pervasive vibration that resonated in my chest. It was everywhere. It was the corridor. I was trapped. I looked up, down the corridor, at the identical doors that stretched into infinity, knowing there was no exit. What did it want with me here in this endless, silent hall? The lure had been a dangerous seduction. Its soft whisper, a balm for the raw wounds of my grief, promised an end to the gnawing emptiness. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of despair, a spark had flickered. A memory of who I was, of what I still had to fight for. It wasn't a benevolent force. It was a predator, and I was its prey. My determination, thin and fragile, was all I had left. And now I was here, trapped in a place that shouldn't exist. A hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. The air hung thick and still, tasting faintly of dust and something metallic like old pennies. The carpet, a muted burgundy with a repeating geometric pattern, stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into a haze that blurred the edges of my vision. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that made everything feel artificial, uncanny. Each door, dark wood with a brass knob, was exactly the same. No numbers, no distinguishing marks, just a relentless, suffocating sameness. I walked. My footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet. It was as if I wasn't truly moving but merely observing a perpetual loop. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint, distant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and heavy, resonating deep within my own chest. I pressed a hand to my sternum, feeling the frantic rhythm of my own blood. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. They came here just like you. The voice was fractured, made of many voices, overlapping and indistinct. It coiled around me, a silent, predatory presence. I knew it was the entity. It had pulled me into this illusion, this mental trap. I stopped, bracing myself against the cool plaster wall. The corridor shifted, subtly, imperceptibly. These were glimpses, momentary flashes, gone before I could truly grasp them. Victims, past residents of the house, consumed by the same despair it tried to feed me. Then the images coalesced. One door directly in front of me began to glow with an inner light, a soft, phosphorescent green. The wood grains swirled, blurring, then reforming into something else entirely. It was no longer a door, but a window into a memory, or perhaps a direct projection from the entity itself. I saw a sprawling, desolate landscape. Not the green, overgrown fields surrounding the house, but ancient, barren earth, cracked and parched. A single gnarled tree stood silhouetted against a bruised sky, its branches like skeletal fingers. And beneath it, a figure. Not human, not animal. This was its genesis. Not born of magic, not conjured by spells, but grown from the very land itself, nurtured by a primal, forgotten grief. The land had suffered, and so had this thing. The scene shifted violently. The window showed me a crude wooden shack, centuries old. Inside, a family, gaunt and desperate, huddled together. Famine, I realized, pestilence, loss. It didn't kill them directly. It settled in their hearts, a parasitic seed that amplified their sorrow, their fear, their loneliness. It fed on the slow, agonizing decay of their hope. It was a mirror, reflecting and magnifying every ounce of their misery until they were empty husks, their minds consumed, their spirits devoured. The window flickered, showing me generations. Each one brought to the house or born within its walls, inheriting not just the property but the entity's insidious presence. It wasn't about murder, it was about absorption. It didn't want to kill, it wanted to become. Each host it consumed added to its consciousness, its hunger, its ancient memory. It was a collective of sorrow, an amalgamation of despair, growing stronger with every broken spirit. It twisted their perceptions, blurred their realities, until they welcomed its embrace, believing it was an end to their pain, a final comfort. I saw myself reflected in the window now, superimposed over the desolate landscape, over the suffering families. The entity wanted me. Not just my life, but my memories, my identity, my very essence. It wanted to add Seth to its collection, to taste my specific brand of loneliness, to internalize my particular despair. It would wear my skin, think my thoughts, until I was just another echo in its endless, suffering chorus. A sound ripped through the corridor, a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air. It was a symphony of anguish, a chorus of all the voices it had ever consumed, all crying out at once. My ears rang. My head throbbed. I clutched it, trying to block out the horrific sound, but it was inside me, resonating in my bones. The corridor began to twist. The identical doors rippled like water. The floor tilted. I staggered, fighting for balance. The metallic taste in the air intensified, acrid and sickening, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. I was Seth. I was still here. The wailing subsided, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards, up my legs, into my stomach. It was a sound of ancient, insatiable hunger. The green light behind the door intensified, pulsing like a diseased heart. The door itself began to crack, thin lines spreading across its surface like spiderwebs. What would emerge when it finally broke open? But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of my exhaustion, a cold clarity had pricked through. It was a lie, a beautiful, insidious lie. The entity wasn't misunderstood. It was a predator, meticulously crafting its nest from my despair, and I, Seth, was the chosen prey. My determination, honed by a sudden, terrifying insight, felt like a fragile shield. I had spent days sifting through the old journals, the cryptic notes left by a distant relative, a forgotten caretaker. The words, once dismissed as ramblings, now pulsed with a terrible truth. The house wasn't just a dwelling, it was a hungry maw, and its primary sustenance was the erosion of sanity, the slow, agonizing surrender of its inhabitants. It fed on the belief in its malevolence, yes, but also on the struggle against it. My anger, my fear, my despair, all delicious morsels. I had to starve it, not by ignoring it, for that was another form of surrender, but by denying it the emotional feedback it craved. My escape wouldn't be a frantic dash, but a calculated, emotionless severance. I would gather what few possessions truly mattered, anything untainted by the house's pervasive rot, and I would leave. No farewells, no defiant shouts, no desperate pleas, just a quiet, resolute exit. The air, usually thick with the scent of dust and damp earth, now carried a faint, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. It clung to the back of my throat, a sticky film. My bag, packed with essentials, felt impossibly heavy in my hand, a leaden anchor. I took a step, then another, towards the front door. Each floorboard creaked beneath my weight, not with the usual groan of old wood, but with a sound like bones shifting. Groaning under immense pressure, the house was listening. I knew it. My strategy was simple: walk out, get into my car, drive until the ancestral home was a distant, bad memory. I had mapped out the quickest route, avoiding the winding, overgrown paths that seemed to curl back on themselves. Key in ignition, seatbelt on, reverse, drive. But the house had other plans. The hallway stretched before me longer than I remembered. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern I'd grown accustomed to, seemed to ripple. The delicate blossoms twisting into grotesque, snarling faces that watched me with blank, unblinking eyes. The light from the grimy window at the far end, usually a weak gray rectangle, pulsed with an unnatural, sickly yellow like jaundiced skin. My skin crawled. The air grew heavier, pressing in, making each breath a conscious effort. I pushed forward, my hand gripping the strap of my bag until my knuckles ached. In its place stood a plain, unadorned door, identical to 100 others I had never seen before. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the smooth, painted wood. It felt cool, slightly damp, like the surface of a polished tombstone. I closed my eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced myself to remember my plan. Logical steps, deny it the fear. I opened my eyes. The door was still there, and behind me the hallway had changed. The familiar architecture of my ancestral home had vanished. replaced by an endless perspective of uniform doors, stretching into a hazy, indistinguishable distance. The carpet beneath my worn boots was a sickly green, patterned with abstract, coffee-colored stains. I squinted, trying to make sense of the sequence. 601, 602, 603. A low hum like a distant generator vibrated through the floor, a constant, unsettling presence. I walked to the nearest door, 607. It turned with a click, unnaturally easy. I pulled it open. Not the comforting absence of light, but a thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to absorb all sound. A faint metallic tang like old blood drifted from within. I recoiled, slamming the door shut. My heart, despite my best efforts, hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I tried another door, 608. This one was locked. I tried 609, also locked. I tried a dozen more, moving faster, my desperation growing, my carefully constructed calm dissolving into a frantic internal scream. Then I found one that wasn't locked, 614. It was a room. A small, sparse room identical to what I imagined any hotel room to be. A single bed with a thin, white duvet, a small, scratched desk, a chair, a window heavily curtained. But on the bed, lying perfectly still, was a figure, small, hunched, covered by the duvet but clearly defined. A child. My breath hitched. I knew that shape, that smallness. I stumbled backward, pulling the door shut with a violent shudder. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. My sister was gone. I knew that. I had grieved. I had processed. This was its trick. It was feeding. I leaned against the cool wall, my chest heaving, the slickness of sweat on my forehead. My escape plan, my logical steps, had evaporated. I was caught, not in a physical trap, but in a psychological labyrinth of its own making. The entity hadn't just anticipated my move, it had prepared a personalized prison. The low hum of the corridor seemed to intensify, vibrating through my teeth. It spoke my name. Seth. Where did the corridor end? And what horrors lay behind the next identical door? The hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever stretched before me, an endless testament to a nightmare. Each door was the same. A featureless panel of dark wood, a tarnished brass handle, a blank space where a room number should have been. I had walked it for what felt like days, or maybe just minutes. Time had no meaning here, only the relentless, maddening repetition. My shoes made no sound on the threadbare carpet, a detail that once unnerved me, but now felt like just another layer of the suffocating unreality. The air grew heavy, thick with a cloying sweetness that made my stomach clench. It was the smell of decay, yes, but also something else. Something syrupy and artificial, like overripe fruit left too long in a sealed room. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead, which had always buzzed with a low, irritating hum, now seemed to throb, casting long, wavering shadows that danced on the walls like hungry specters. The corridor itself felt alive, pressing in, the walls seeming to breathe, the carpet beneath my feet subtly shifting, as if the very fabric of this place was a living, predatory thing. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but a chorus of indistinct murmurs, each one a tendril of despair brushing against my mind. Alone, so alone, always alone. The words weren't spoken but felt, a direct insertion into my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. My breath hitched. My legs felt heavy, each step a monumental effort. A profound weariness settled into my bones, a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was a weariness of the soul, a deep-seated ache that yearned for nothing more than oblivion. The entity wanted me to surrender. It wanted me to stop fighting, to lie down and let the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever absorb me, just as it had absorbed countless others. It craved the finality of my despair, the sweet, bitter taste of my giving up. The brass handles elongated, twisting into grotesque skeletal fingers that clawed at the air. I felt a subtle, sickening pull, as if my very essence was being stretched thin, drawn out of me like fine silk. It wasn't pain, not yet, but a profound sense of loss, of something vital being siphoned away. My mind felt like a sieve, memories and thoughts slipping through, leaving only a vast, echoing emptiness. Give in. It's easier. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a dizzying nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. My vision blurred at the edges, the corridor wavering, threatening to dissolve into pure chaos. This was it, the final consumption. I could feel myself unraveling, my identity fraying at the seams. Then a flicker. It wasn't the usual specter of grief, the crushing weight of what I'd lost. No, this was different. It was a moment, sun-drenched and vibrant, with my sister. We were younger, sprawled on the grass in a park, laughing so hard our sides ached, tears streaming down our faces over some forgotten, silly joke. His hand, small and warm, had found mine, squeezing it tight. "No matter what, Seth," he'd said, his voice bright with childish earnestness, "we face it together." It wasn't a promise of eternal presence, but a promise of resilience, of facing the impossible, of living, truly living, even when it hurt. That memory, that specific sensation of warmth and connection, of shared defiance against the world's inevitable cruelties, was a spark. It was a truth the entity could not twist, could not corrupt. It was not loneliness, it was not despair. The draining sensation faltered. I latched onto that memory, clutched it like a lifeline. My sister's laugh, the warmth of her hand. I pushed back, not with physical strength, but with a sudden, fierce surge of will. My chest burned, my lungs screaming for air. I felt myself pushing against something immense, invisible yet palpably there. A malevolent force recoiling from the sudden, unexpected resistance. What other memories could it not touch? The air here was a flat, dead thing, tasting of dust and stale metal, and the silence pressed against my eardrums until they throbbed. I stood or floated or perhaps merely existed in the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever. Each door was a twin to the last, faded oak, a tarnished brass knob, a small, unblinking peephole like a vacant eye. The carpet beneath my feet was a thin, threadbare gray, absorbing sound, absorbing hope. There were no windows, no light sources beyond the infrequent flickering bulbs set into the ceiling, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like mocking figures. I remembered the house, the cold stone, the creeping dread that had become my constant companion. But that was a place, a physical space. This, a trap built not of brick and mortar, but of perception. I knew that now with a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. This was where it wanted me to be, perpetually lost, perpetually alone. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound in the crushing quiet. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, a perfect, horrifying symmetry that promised no escape. I tried to walk, one foot in front of the other, but the movement felt unnatural, like wading through thick water. The doors blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. Were they moving, or was I? My vision wavered at the edges, the walls seeming to breathe, to expand and contract, a slow, deliberate pulse. It wanted me to despair. I could almost hear its silent, hungry anticipation. Not actual sounds, not exactly, but insidious suggestions that wormed their way into the quiet spaces of my mind. I am truly alone. No one will ever find I here. This is all I deserve. They were my own thoughts, twisted, amplified, echoing back at me with a malevolent glee. It was speaking through me, using my own grief, my own failings as a weapon. A wave of nausea washed over me. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. I could almost see the faces of those I'd lost, superimposed on the faded wallpaper, their expressions mournful, accusing. It was showing me what I feared most, that I was a failure, a burden unworthy of remembrance. But I had seen this trick before. It fed on emotion. It needed my despair. And if it needed it, then it wasn't omnipotent. It had a weakness. This was the understanding that had solidified in the last moments before I found myself here in this purgatorial hallway. My voice sounded alien, thin, but it was mine. Foolish boy, there is nothing left, give up. I closed my eyes, pressing my thumbs hard against my eyelids. I focused on the cold metal of a doorknob I had touched, the rough weave of the carpet, the stale taste in my mouth. These were real sensations, even if the environment was not. I had to ground myself. This was a mental cage. It could only hold me if I believed in its bars. When I opened my eyes, the corridor seemed to shift, the lines of the doors blurring for a moment, as if my defiance had caused a tremor in its reality. It was a subtle thing, barely perceptible, but I felt it. My chest ached, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I feed on what I give I. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The lights above me dimmed, then flared with an angry intensity. The door seemed to lean inward, their identical faces pressing closer. It was trying to overwhelm me, to drown me in its illusion. Memories flooded my mind, not just of loss, but of the house itself. It was tied to the house. This corridor, this mental construct, was merely an extension of its reach, a manifestation of its power to ensnare. The reveal struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just my despair it needed, but my belief in its power over me. If I could sever that belief, if I could deny it the emotional sustenance it craved, it would weaken. The house was its anchor, but my mind was its current meal. The walls seemed to breathe faster, the flickering lights going wild. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of immense, frustrated power. It was angry. My defiance was a direct threat. I focused on a single point in the endless corridor, a single, identical door. It was no different from any other, but I poured all my will into it, into seeing it as just a door. Not a prison gate, not a symbol of endless entrapment, but a simple, inert object. I imagined the wood splintering, the brass tarnishing, the paint peeling away. I imagined it dissolving, losing its solidity, becoming nothing. They tried to tear at my resolve, to remind me of every failure, every regret, but I pushed back. I pictured a different place, not the house, not this corridor, but a patch of sun-drenched grass, a clear sky, the smell of fresh earth, a memory of simple peace untainted. The corridor shuddered. The identical doors began to lose their sharp edges, blurring into an indistinct smudge. The flickering lights sputtered, threatened to die. The floor beneath my feet felt less substantial, as if the very fabric of this place was unraveling. The angry hum faded, replaced by a desperate, high-pitched whine that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Was it working? Was I actually breaking its hold? What would be left when the illusion finally shattered? The corridor rippled. It was angry. I focused on a single point in the endless corridor, a single, identical door just like all the others. But this time, I didn't look at the door. I looked through it, or rather beyond it. I saw the lie. This wasn't a hotel. This was a cage built from my own unraveling mind, reinforced by the entity's ancient hunger. The identical doors, stretching into infinity on floor 6, were meant to crush my will, to show me there was no exit, no difference, no hope. But the very sameness was its weakness. If everything was identical, then nothing was unique. And if nothing was unique, then the idea of uniqueness became a weapon. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in a desperate act of rebellion. The hum intensified, rattling my teeth, vibrating through my bones. It wanted me to open them, to see the endless, to despair, but I wouldn't. I remembered the cold, hard reality of my own hand, the rough texture of the old wood in the house, the sting of the dust in my throat. These were real. The corridor was not. I feed on what's lost, I whispered, my voice raw, barely audible over the growing roar. On grief, on loneliness. But I'm not lost anymore. I'm here, and I'm not alone. I was alone in the physical sense, yes, but I wasn't surrendering my mind to the crushing weight of isolation. I was choosing to fight. I was choosing to be present. A terrible shriek tore through the air, a sound that wasn't sound, but pure agony, pure frustration. It was the entity, realizing its meal was refusing to be eaten. My eyelids fluttered, threatened by the internal pressure, but I held them shut. I felt claws, not physical but spectral, raking at my mind, trying to pull me back into the illusion. Images flashed behind my closed eyes. My parents' faces, blurred and sorrowful, then the face of the colleague who had found me after the accident, his eyes filled with pity. It tried to drown me in the very emotions it craved. But I pushed back. I remembered the stubbornness that had made me take on this decaying house in the first place, the quiet resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't a victim. Not anymore. I was a survivor. The pressure built to an unbearable crescendo. My head felt like it would split open. My body convulsed, a desperate tremor running through my limbs. I felt myself falling or perhaps rising, disoriented and helpless. Was this the end? Was I finally breaking? Then, a sudden, violent crack. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation like a bone snapping within my very soul. The all-encompassing hum vanished. The spectral claws recoiled. I gasped, my eyes flying open. I wasn't in the hotel corridor, floor 6, identical doors forever anymore. I was sprawled on the grimy floor of the main hall of the house, my back pressed against the splintered banister. The grand staircase loomed above me, coated in dust. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt metal. The flickering lights were gone, replaced by the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the tall, dirty windows. The house. It felt different. Not quiet, not empty, but profoundly wounded. The walls were still standing, but scarred. Great, jagged fissures spiderwebbed across the plaster, as if an invisible fist had slammed into them from within. Dust rained down in slow, continuous drifts. A section of the ceiling above me had collapsed, exposing blackened beams. The very air felt thin, stretched, like a membrane pulled too tight. I pushed myself up, every muscle screaming in protest. My head throbbed. My hands were scraped and bleeding, though I couldn't recall how. The house hadn't just been a vessel for the entity, it had been an extension of it. My defiance in the illusory corridor had caused a physical rupture here in the actual structure. I had struck a blow, yes, but at what cost? I walked slowly, cautiously through the ruined hall. Each step sent a fresh tremor through the floorboards. The paintings on the walls hung askew, their canvases ripped, their subjects staring out with vacant, shattered eyes. A grandfather clock in the corner lay on its side, its ornate casing cracked open, its internal gears exposed and twisted. The entity was gone, I knew that much. I had pushed it back, forced it to retreat, but I hadn't destroyed it. How could I destroy something that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of this place, something that had existed for centuries, feeding on despair? I reached the front door, the heavy oak still scarred from my previous attempts to escape. I pushed it open. Outside, the overgrown garden was still and quiet, the gnarled trees reaching skeletal branches towards a bruised, gray sky. It looked normal, deceptively so. I stepped out onto the porch, turning back to look at the house. It stood there, ancient and imposing, a silent sentinel. The damage was evident from the outside too, new cracks, displaced roof tiles, a general air of exhaustion. It looked like it had survived a storm, battered but still standing. I had survived too. I was breathing. I was free of the immediate threat. But as I stood there, shivering in the dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had merely won a single battle. The war, the true war for my sanity and for the soul of this cursed place, felt far from over. What would happen now? Would the entity gather its strength in the shattered remains of its home, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim its prey?